I think every player who plays Scholar before would agree that Scholar Toolkit is one of the more interactive toolkit in that there's a lot of skill that buff or change another skill, such as deployment tactics, recitations, emergency tactic, to name a few. Despite that, there is one thing in this whole kit that's kinda contradict this. Yep, it's Faerie Gauge. For context, this gauge is one of the two gauge that Scholar have as their job resource, and it's increased when you use these Ether Flow skills. These gauge point then can be used to cast Ether Pack, which is a tether that heal a player over time. Don't get me wrong, the skill Ether Pack is very useful for focus healing a party member, but the system or gameplay behind it, for the lack of a better word, is kinda bland in my opinion. So, in this video, I will talk about that. First, we need to understand where does this issue come from. So, to get a better idea of this gauge, let me take you back to where this gauge came into 14 for the first time. The year was 2017. Everyone and their mother has fidget spinner in their hand as it become the global sensations. But that's not important. You know what else happened in 2017? And 14 player got their hands on the new features that was added, the job gauge. Yup, 14 didn't have a job gauge until Stormblood. Imagine playing Astro without job gauge in Heavensward. Yeah, you guys have my respect. All of the job got their new and flashy gauge to keep track of their job specific resources, and Scholar is no exceptions. However, Scholar not only get their gauge for their old resource, but also a new gauge with a new resource that come with a new skill. The way Faerie Gauge worked back then is exactly the same as today, except some number changes. The gauge will increase whenever an Ether Flow stack is spent, and the gauge can be used to focus heal a party member via Ether Pack. Oh, also fun fact. Back then in Stormblood, Eos and Selene has different Faerie skill. Eos skills are for healing, mitigations, and healing buff, while Selene's are for increasing attack speed, silence, and group Isuna. Then it stayed like that for 2 more years until we reach Shadowbringers. In Shadowbringers of 5.0, Square Enix added minimal versions of the gauge and expand on the Faerie Gauge mechanic by adding another skill that uses it to activate, and that is Fae Blessing. The skill is an AoE healing around the fairy that use 10 Faerie Gauge. This can come in handy when you find yourself without Ether Flow stack and need to heal in a clutch. Also, Summon Seraph was added during Shadowbringers, but that doesn't change the gauge much other than having Seraph timers on the gauge once activated to show you how much time is left before Seraphs leave the field. Then later into Endwalker, the Faerie Gauge cost of Fae Blessing is removed and no additional skill that interact with Faerie Gauge is introduced. And finally in Dawntrail, it is Radio Silence. I think you can see what is going on here. It's like they wanted to build on this new Scholar mechanic during Stormblood 2 Shadowbringers, but then the development kinda stopped since Endwalker. I think there's probably some decision changes going on about Scholar design directions that might be hugely addressed during the 9.0 overall job changes that Yoshi P mentioned, but that's just a guess. Please take this with a copious amount of salt. Hey, just wanna quickly say that I live stream over at Twitch on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 PM GMT plus 7. If you wanna hang out and chill, please feel free to drop by. Okay, that's it. Back to the video. Okay, now that we look at how this job gauge came into the pictures, I'll explain why this job gauge deserves its own videos. The biggest reason in my opinion is how underdeveloped this side of the mechanic is when compared to other part of the job. If we compare Ether Flow mechanic to this, the depth of these two is miles apart because there are so many things that you can do with Ether Flow, such as Sacred Soil, Excog, Lustrate, Indom, or Energy Drain. And when we cut to Faerie Gauge, it's just Ether Pack. Albeit this is probably because of the button bloat problem, but I still can't see why they can't add on to the Faerie Gauge while they introduce Servism, right? Which is a whole new button, you know? And in my humble opinions, I rather prefer that they expand on the existing mechanics rather than adding more things to the whole kit. Also, having only one skill that uses gauge makes it feels very limited due to the fact that Ether Pack is a single target regen skill and it is kinda niche in my perspective. If there's more skill that allow us to burn the gauge while cater to dealing with more situation, I think that will make this gauge more interesting. But enough of pointing at the problem, let me present some of my idea on how to tweak this mechanic to maybe increase the depth and maybe add more fun factor into it. Okay, big disclaimer first that this is just for fun without balancings or optimizations in mind. Alright, with that out of the way, allow me to present some of my questionable job design decisions if I am able to tweak the Faerie Gauge. Starting with a quick and simple one, which is a skill that allows a full Faerie Gauge to be converted back to one Etherflow stack. This is pretty straightforward, but in my opinion will solve the problems of overcapping Faerie Gauge, because with these options, right, Faerie Gauge will act like another backup Etherflow source like dissipations. Although one problem that I can spot with this idea is that this might literally make Etherpack obsolete, because the many options that Etherflow stack offer that most of the time overshadow Etherpack. So let's move on. If we want to go to the other route of adding new skill rather than convert it back to Etherflow, then this opens a lot of options for us to play around. But if you ask me, I would rather keep it in Faerie theme though. So something like the old Fae Wind, which increase everyone attack speed. Thematic speaking, this will add more support vibe to Scholar even more, which reinforce the lore of being a strategic mastermind in battle and a backline support of Nemean forces. Another idea is maybe another offensive GCD that deal damage around Faerie to help with Scholar damage uptime, since this adds more offensive option to the job, and it looks like this is going to be the trend moving forward with the directions of adding more offensive skill to healer in Dawn Trail. To be honest, there's a lot of things that can be created here, but those are my favorite idea that I can think of. Okay, one last idea. What if we can kinda redesign the gauge? Remove Etherpack out of the pictures and make the gauge into something that you need to maintain to get a certain buff. Let's say if Faerie Gauge is at 30%, your healing get buff, or maybe your Faerie healing speed will increase. And at 60% you get another buff which increase your attack. And these buffs stay as long as you maintain the set Faerie Gauge threshold. Then we add or change two skills. We add one skill that will cast shield onto the target, which will cost 30% Faerie Gauge. And at 60% gauge, we change Ruin 2 into, I don't know, Ruin 4? Which is instant cast offensive GCD that has high potency and will cost 60% Faerie Gauge. This means that we are integrating Faerie Gauge into our 2-minute burst while also giving a bit more tools to the Scholar. But this is probably gonna be unbalanced as hell, and that's why I don't want to give a specific numbers on it. In my opinion, if Faerie Gauge is just going to sit there on our screen waiting for sustained damage on tank, why don't we make it into something more flashy and interactive, you know? But of course, this is far from perfect, heck even good, and I just want to throw the idea out there to start a conversation, you know. And with that, I think that is it for this video. Please let me know your thought in the comments below. I'll see y'all later. Bye! And thank you Kuching911, Larry Smith, Rin Ishikawa, Itzinos, Uriel Yubina, and Hana515 for supporting the channel.